Hola, José. Muchas gracias por tu introducción. Thank you for having me. Es un placer estar aquí hoy. Y I'm going to give the talk in English, but you can ask me questions in Spanish at the end if you prefer. I'm Portuguese, so I speak a sort of Portuñol language, but I think you'll understand me. So let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive load, right? And the theme is Tetris. Jose already introduced me, but just so you know, I've had a number of different roles in my career, my experience. I've been a developer, tester, team lead, so that gave me a good perspective on how different teams look at things, and obviously at the software delivery and the operations. The book was mentioned, Team Topologies. So these days, that's what I'm mostly known as, one of the co-authors of the book. It's published by IT Revolution Press, so it's the same publisher as DevOps Handbook, the Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project, so you might know some of these books, and Accelerate as well. So I hope people know Tetris, otherwise I'm going to feel very old, but I think young people still know about Tetris, still play it. You can actually play online at tetris.com. That's where I got these screenshots from. So let's, Tetris, very simple game, but very interesting, where you have different pieces with different sizes and shapes, and you have to fit them together to complete the frame, if you like. So let's look at this and say, let's say this is the cognitive load for a given team, right? So we're trying to avoid to fill up the team's cognitive load, right? Because then they're going into overload, and it's very hard to manage the demand of work and to do it properly with quality and speed. And these days, for modern software delivery, there is an increasing number of capabilities and skills that are being requested from teams. So we're talking about things like CI/CD, understanding the cloud, how do we create infrastructure, how do infrastructure as code, how do we embed security, with DevSecOps as well, how do we include security much earlier in the life cycle. So we're asking a single team to take care of a lot more sort of aspects of software delivery. So let's say, for the sake of it, that these different capabilities are different types of pieces in the Tetris game, right? And we'll come back to the game in a minute. But again, when we look at modern software delivery and operations, it's not just coding and testing and architecture and design, it's all these other things as well. So teams are being asked to understand all these different cloud providers, cloud services, managed infrastructure, understand how do we improve the reliability of our services. All these things are being asked from a team. And if you look at it closely, it's still just in order to build the product right. So it's assuming we know what we should build, or that someone knows what we should build, and that we're going to do it in the right way, with the right approach. But John Cutler, who I highly recommend following him if you're interested in product development, but especially because he looks at it from organization and team angle and the dynamics around that. But he said already a couple of years ago, great products emerge from empowered, fully cross-functional teams. So this, seems rather obvious these days, maybe not 10 or 5 years ago, but these days seems rather straightforward, and that's kind of sort of what Agile was saying. But it's not so easy, is it? Right? It's not so easy to get the right mix of skills, the right people who understand business, understand technical aspects in the same team. And so if we're looking from more of the product perspective, what else do we need to know? We need to know about, how do we understand if the customer is happy? What are the customer needs? What kind of customers do we have? What is helping the business metrics or not? What is the viability of the product? How do we provide a very high level experience for our users? So user experience focus as well. So all these other pieces that come into play, right? And that's if we want to build the right product, right? If we understand that we can't just assume we know what customers are going to need and use, we need to do discovery as well, and we need to understand all these other things as well to provide a really engaging product or service that our customers, are really happy about, and they want more of it. So it's getting complicated, right? So if we go back to the Tetris, we already talked about all these technical aspects, and now we're saying, well, you also need to understand UX, and you need to understand business metrics, and you need to understand product viability, proper QA strategies, customer satisfaction, business satisfaction, all those things in a single team. So it's getting really overloaded. And we could even add here also other things that tend to happen, such as, we're adopting new ways of working like Agile or DevOps or SRE. That's also going to add up to the team's cognitive load, right? Obviously, those are all important things for us to improve our the way we deliver and run our services and our business. But we need to think about, how do we do this in a sustainable way, right? How do we manage these expectations on teams in a way that doesn't overload the team, or even, in the worst case, burn out the team, or has a significant impact on the services that they provide, that they end up being low quality or slow to change, or whatever is happening in a negative way. So what should we do? Just game over? Probably it's not what we want, right? Also, because that would mean I would stop my presentation very quickly. So that's not what we want, right? We want to find sustainable ways to keep, let's say, the game going, that we manage cognitive load in a better way. So let's dig a bit more into what is this idea of cognitive load, team cognitive load. So it's actually, cognitive load was defined from an individual perspective by John Sweller. He's a psychologist. So this is back from the 1980s. As the total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory for an individual. So interestingly, people who are dedicated to user experience tend to think a lot about what is the cognitive load for the users to, accomplish some tasks or follow some workflow, and let's try to minimize the cognitive load for our users. So we can bring this into the team view, right? It's not, let's say, a scientific measure, but we can say the cognitive load of a team is the sort of the sum of the cognitive capacity of the different team members, or the cognitive load of different team members. So if we look at this from a team perspective, in particular a team that's responsible for software delivery and running a service or product, there are 3 different types of cognitive load that are going on at any moment. The first one is called intrinsic cognitive load. So this has to do with all the skills that we need to do our day-to-day job in our team. So in this example, if we're working with a Java application in a bank, let's say, we're probably going to need to know, or definitely going to need to know, how do I create classes? How do I create unit tests for Java? Which packages exist? All these different things that you would need just to be able to do your day-to-day work of evolving that kind of Java-based software. Then we have extraneous cognitive load. This is everything which is sort of not directly related to the task, to the problem we're trying to solve, but things that need to happen for us to deliver value, to deliver the changes. And so if we need to remember, how do I deploy my application to the cloud? That's going to take up some of our working memory, and that's extraneous cognitive load. Or how do I create some new infrastructure for a new version of my service? All these things that we have to kind of think and upload in our memory are sort of extraneous. And finally, germane. So germane cognitive load has to do with the problem solution domain, right? So again, in banking, if we're working on end user banking application, probably need to know how the bank transfers work, and what are commissions for bank accounts, and all these different things that you are way more familiar with than I am. So this is all the germane part, right? This is where we're actually, as a team, adding value to customers and to the business, if we're evolving our service or product to be better. And that's where we want to focus most of our capacity. So sort of it's a little simplistic, but let's say it's sort of this kind of approach where intrinsic is around skills, extraneous around the mechanisms, the things that need to happen, and germane is the domain focus. If we know this, then the consequence is we want to maximize germane capacity, right? We want to spend more effort on the germane, on the problem solving, and less on the kind of extraneous and intrinsic. And for intrinsic, reducing intrinsic cognitive load, we have a lot of kind of techniques and ways of doing that, such as either classical training, people pair programming, mob programming, code reviews, hackathons, and all these different things can help reduce intrinsic cognitive load, right? The extraneous is not always so easy. And so the rest of this talk is about how do we sort of tame, in the sense of how do we deal with this increasing cognitive load for most teams. The first thing is to make cognitive load more explicit, right? Most people identify with this idea that we have too much cognitive load. They understand what it means, and they feel like we're overloaded, and that's kind of preventing us to do better, to do more, because we have all this cognitive load that we're struggling with. So let's try to make that more explicit. It's not like I said, it's not a scientific exact number that we give to cognitive load, but we can understand how much is it, which teams are struggling to kind of deliver and run their products. Because at the end, what we want to achieve ideally is that each service or product must be fully owned by a team with sufficient cognitive capacity to build and operate it, right? That's how we achieve fast flow. We have a single team that owns sort of a slice of a larger product or its own service, and they can evolve it mostly in a kind of self-sufficient way. That is the ideal, if you like. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. So regardless if it's microservices or it's something else that we're using as sort of our architecture patterns, the important thing is that the service or part of the product is owned by the team with sufficient capacity, cognitive capacity to deal with it, to evolve, to run, to improve this service. And maybe we can use some metrics as sort of a proxy, like mean time to repair might give us an idea of how long it takes for us to repair and recover from problems, which sort of indicates if it's very long, that means maybe we don't have a good understanding of the service. But it's not a very direct measure, right? There might be other reasons why MTTR is quite high, for example. And so we can actually start conversations around cognitive load. We can ask the teams. That's the best ways to ask the teams. What is your engineering experience today? How hard is it to build? How hard is it to test, to deploy? How hard is it to run, to diagnose problems in production for your service, right? All these questions can help us get an idea of where is the cognitive load? What are the things that are difficult because maybe cognitive load is too high? There's too much we need to know about. So this is a simple, it's an example form that you can use as a starting point. You need to adapt it to your specific context, right? There might be a cognitive load from, we don't know enough about regulations in banking, for example, to do our work in a better way, in a more efficient way. It can be anything, but for the engineering part tends to be common to many organizations. So you can start there and basically you start having conversation with teams. What are the areas where you feel like you're overloaded and that you have too much intrinsic or extraneous cognitive load, and what can we do about that? Of course, this idea of each service being fully owned by a team with sufficient cognitive capacity to build and operate it has to come along with a proper alignment with the business and the sort of value streams, if you like, and then the substreams within each value stream. Because if we're just looking from a technical perspective and we're saying, okay, great, then we're going to have microservices and align the teams to the microservices. Okay, this can help. This means that we already have teams that are owning a microservice. But if the way we design the microservices is not aligned to the streams from the business and the customers, then we might still end up with this, right? Where we want to develop a feature, and now we need to get 4, 5, 10 teams involved to change all their microservices. So that's probably not what we want, right? Then we're impacting the flow, we're impacting the speed at which we can move on, because the way we organize the services is not aligned with the streams of business, right? So just keep this in mind. I'm not going to talk a lot in detail about this, but you can ask me questions at the end. So after we kind of surfaced, if you like, the cognitive load on teams, we start seeing where some of the issues are. We also need to think about, how do we size the software according to the teams? And again, microservices might be helpful. Obviously, there's a lot to learn from a technical perspective in terms of how do we deploy and test and operate microservices in an efficient way. But actually, what we want to do is limit the size of software services to the cognitive load that the team can handle, right? This is sort of the reverse from the previous one. We need often to be explicitly saying and looking at ways in which we can sort of break down our monolith into pieces that make sense for one team, right? For the cognitive load that one team can handle. And so again, it might be microservice, maybe it can be macro services or whatever you want to call it. Something that makes sense on its own, that's aligned to the business streams of work, and that one team can handle. That's kind of the what we should be looking at. Whether that's microservice or not, I think it's a question that can come later. And obviously, we can get a lot of insights from how do we run microservices efficiently. And if you're familiar with sort of literature, a lot of people kind of argue about what exactly is a microservice, what's the size, etc. So focusing on the team, we think is a better approach. What is the team size service? And when you have this approach, you tend to end up with what you see here on the right side. Systems which are split, so larger systems which are split in smaller services that are aligned to the teams, that fit the capacity of the team. So what you see on the right side is a team-first sort of architecture design, if you like, which is also at the same time is a view on which teams exist, right? So the architecture of the system and the view on which teams exist and how they were related starts to become sort of the same thing at a very high level, obviously. And on the left side, you see what happens usually when we don't focus on the teams as the unit of the architecture, and then we have smaller, very small pieces that maybe someone developed and now that person is somewhere else or has left the company, and we don't have knowledge around this smaller piece of the system, or we have maybe some teams with a very large part of the system which they're really overloaded with on their cognitive capacity. And finally, using adequate team topologies, right? So there's not a single right topology, a single model, but there can be many ways in which we're organized that are not very effective. So the word topology actually means the way different parts, like if you like, in a system are interrelated or arranged. So obviously we're talking about how teams are interrelated, how they relate to each other. And we start with the streamlined team, which is sort of the team with that end-to-end ownership that I was talking about a little bit earlier. So teams align to streams of work that have a business meaning or a customer meaning, but that are responsible for a service or part of a product that it's a good size for one team to handle. So that means they have end-to-end ownership of this service. And that's the fastest way to get changes to production because the work never leaves this team. And it's also the fastest way to get feedback because we're talking about a sort of build and run team, if you like, in DevOps terms. So they are running the service as well. So they're getting feedback. They're the first kind of team that gets the feedback from how their service is doing. And so they're able to take that feedback, hopefully also from customers and from the running system, and integrate that in the next iteration of the service. So for fast flow, we would expect most teams to be stream aligned or value stream aligned with end-to-end ownership if we want fast flow. There are some cases where that might not be the purpose, but they're very few. They're fewer and fewer, as you know, obviously. And in banking, it's no difference with fintech and all the pressure to kind of start moving faster. So, okay, we said ideal we have mostly streamlined teams, but we also said earlier these teams are overloaded with all the demands if they're to be have end-to-end ownership of their service and build and run and also understand what customers need and what should we do next. So that's where the other types of teams come in and where the idea of a topology starts to make sense. We need to think from a kind of team of teams perspective. How do we handle this? So the first type of team besides streamline is an enabling team. So an enabling teams reduce the learning curve for new capabilities. And the way to do that is teaching and mentoring. I don't know in your case, but I've seen many organizations where they say, well, we don't have enough people who are experts in user experience for all the teams, or we don't have enough people with mobile development skills for every team. And so that means we cannot do proper mobile development in many services. And so that would be an example where maybe it makes sense to, instead of having the people that are experts in those domains doing the work for others and becoming a bottleneck, why aren't they becoming a sort of enabling team? And you don't need to have huge teams and you don't need to have permanent teams, but you can say, let's try maybe for 6 months to have our mobile experts enabling other teams, teaching and mentoring. Obviously, it requires a mindset of how do I teach, how do I mentor, not doing things for others, right? We're not there to, fix their problems. We're there to teach them these capabilities. But it can be very effective, and we don't necessarily need to go out and hire 20 UX people, or which can take a long time if you ever get to find those 20 people. And so leveraging the expertise that already exists in the organization in ways that are more productive, that are more enabling for most teams. And it's sort of like if we're, as a streamlined team, then we start to be able to handle the pieces of the Tetris faster, right? We have a better understanding of these different pieces, how they, what do they mean, what technology is involved, what are good practices around in the mobile development, for example, or UX, which practices should we adopt. And so we can play the game sort of faster, right? We can do better with the pieces that we're being dealt because we have more skills, more understanding. Next, we have platform teams. For us, platform teams' goal is to provide services that enable the streamlined teams to deliver their work with substantial autonomy. Platform is an overloaded term. So many different people have different ideas of what a platform team is or what a platform is. So I'll give you our definition, or which definition we like to use. But from a purpose perspective, the platform will be valuable if it helps streamline teams do the work they need to do with more autonomy, with less dependencies on other teams, right? That's how we go faster. So interestingly, a few years ago at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, I saw this talk from Daniele Romano from ING, I think in the Netherlands. And he was talking about continuous delivery as a service. So this I think was one of the, now it's quite common, but at the time, 2017, I think was one of the first times I heard about that term. So I thought it was really interesting. Of course, it only helps if we're not imposing ways of working that are rigid on people, right? for continuous delivery, for example. Different teams might have slightly different needs. If we're making everyone work in exactly the same way, with exactly the same pipelines, exactly the same things and tools, that might not be very as helpful as a platform can be. But this idea of continuous delivery as a service was quite interesting. And I think it's in line with what we're saying. So the definition we use is from Evan Butcher. He said a digital platform is the foundation of self-service APIs, tools, services, knowledge, and support arranged as a compelling internal product. That's quite long, and there's a lot there, but kind of highlight. First, it's self-service, meaning it's not a request-based platform where teams send requests for us to do things, to create infrastructure or to deploy an application, because that slows down flow. That means work is leaving the team and going to the platform. Team in this case. So it's a self-service based approach where teams can self-serve what they need. They can create their own infrastructure. They can use the services and tools that to do their work without depending on another team to do things for them. There's knowledge and support around this platform. So obviously we're thinking about teams that are supporting, creating the platform and supporting the streamlined teams. We're providing adequate documentation. We're providing adequate ways for teams to understand how do I use the platform. And finally, arrange as a compelling internal product basically means we're not imposing the platform on teams, because that kind of sets the wrong incentives for the platform itself, because now we're not accountable whether the platform is helping or not. We're just building the stuff with the best intention, but they might not actually be what teams need, right? But if it's a product, meaning streamlined teams can opt in or not to use continuous delivery services from the platform, that there's an incentive that we need to make it simple to use and providing value to our internal teams. And I see the platform, when done in this way, with this sort of definition, what it does is kind of remove a lot of these pieces from the Tetris game, right? It becomes simpler because we're offloading a lot of this stuff. Some of these pieces are not coming into our kind of game anymore for the streamlined team. We know we can use the platform. We understand how it works. It has a high user experience, developer experience. So, it makes our life easier. We have less moving pieces, if you like, in our Tetris game. And finally, we have complicated subsystem team. So complicated subsystem team will build and evolve part of a system which requires specialized PhD knowledge. This is sort of something we had to include because there is that scenario sometimes, but we're not talking about traditional component team or a DevOps team, because DevOps is special. It's something that really requires such specialized knowledge that we cannot ask a streamlined team to take care of this part of the system. But you still need to develop with the same good practices around DevOps and versioning and testing and everything, so that other teams can use this complicated subsystem adequately in an easy way, right? I don't have a very good analogy for the Tetris, but it's like if you would give this complicated subsystem to the streamlined team, was almost like suddenly game over in terms of cognitive load. It would just sort of explode, because we have to deal with all the kind of life cycle of our service. And now on top of that, if we have this complicated subsystem, it's just really difficult. And on the other hand, we might have a complicated subsystem team or a subsystem that is only used by one streamlined team, and that could be okay, because it's not about shared subsystem. It's about we need a team because the cognitive load is too high to hand this to the streamlined team. So I'm getting close to the end, but besides the fundamental topologies, we also need to think about how are they related, right? How do they interact? Because we saw topology means the way different teams interact and are related. So we talk about three clearly defined interaction modes. Collaboration, where we have two teams working together for a defined period of time with a specific purpose or goal. It's not open-ended collaboration. It's what are we trying to do with this interaction? We have this purpose. X as a service is one team provides services to other teams that consume it. Usually a platform provides X as a service when the service is stable enough has a good user experience, that it can be consumed by all the other internal teams. And facilitating is typical for enabling teams, where one team helps another upskill, gain awareness, understand some new domain. But the interaction modes can happen between almost any kind of teams. Just they tend to be more common for certain types of teams than others. So when we put these things together, we can also start having sort of organizational view on, at least for a subset of teams, of which teams exist, what are they trying to achieve? Are they streamlined? Is there enabling team? Is there a platform team? How are they interacting today or in the near future? Are they collaborating on a new version of a platform service, perhaps? Or do we expect in 3 months or 6 months that we're going to need some new platform service? So it starts to allow us to think about the evolution of the organization, of the teams, and the capabilities that we're looking for. So we think that when used with care, these are the only 4 fundamental types of teams and the 3 interaction modes that we need to build and run modern software systems. So team topology is not about creating a lot of new teams or hiring a lot of consultants or new people to do new work. No, it's about sort of in my perspective, a healthier ecosystem of teams that we understand. We're talking about a team of teams. It's not each individual team summed up. It's more than that, because we have much more clarity on what is the expected behaviors, what is what is the mission of each team, and also who are the customers of those teams. These are things that tend to be often not super clear, right? So teams are doing their work, they're trying to do their best, but we don't have the proper setup, or what should we be doing? Which customers should we be serving? Because we might have too many demands, and we need to focus on our true customers. We need to understand what is our mission and how should we behave with other teams. So I think it's a more effective approach to evolve the organization based on the business and the technical needs, right? It's not a model per se that we say, go and follow this specific model. It's an approach for evolving the organization. So very briefly, I know I'm probably at the end of the time. We looked at how do we tame cognitive load and why is the problem cognitive load, making it more explicit, looking at organizing our software in team-sized chunks or services, and then think about what are some adequate team topologies. Unfortunately, we cannot pause cognitive load, right? But we can address it. We can start to make it more intentional and start looking at, are we improving our teams, having more of the capabilities and the help that they need? Of course, there are many other important things that we talk about in the book. How do we identify independent services that we can align the teams to? How do we avoid Conway's law mismatches? How do we do organizational sensing, right? We want to evolve the organization. How do we know how to sense and detect some triggers? I'm really at the end. So the last slides are just some free resources. If you're interested to know more, we have some infographics as kind of a high-level overview. We now have our academy for online training. There's a workbook coming up. I don't know if still this year or early next year, which is applying the ideas of team topology, some of the ideas to remote working. And we have a newsletter as well. I think the slides will be available, so you'll be able to look at these resources later on. I want to make sure there's time for questions. So I hope it was useful, and I'll stop sharing now.
Okay. Thanks,
I'll start
Manuel.
my camera.
Very inspiring